David Livingstone, the famous missionary to Africa, well known I'm sure to many listening into this, he stated that as he was going through Africa, going through the centre of Africa, he stated, "I am prepared to go anywhere, provided it be forward." That was really the great plea of his Christian life, that he would do anything, go anywhere, provided he was going forward with the Lord. In Genesis chapter 40, if you were to take Joseph's circumstances, the fact that he's in prison and all that he has faced there in prison, well, if you were just to look at that in terms of a standalone event in his life, then you would probably say to yourself, well, Joseph is not going forward with the Lord. Joseph has had a real roller coaster of a ride up until Genesis chapter 40. In chapter 37, he bursts on the scene as a young man, a young lad really, and he has his older brothers, but of course they sell him into the hands of the slave traders, and he eventually ends up in Egypt. But things then start to look up for Joseph. As a young man, he lands a decent job. However, in Genesis chapter 40, now in Egypt, now far away from his father, his brothers, his father of course thinks he's dead, Jacob. And now in Genesis chapter 40, he, as I said, it doesn't appear that he is going forward. In actual fact, if you take his job in chapter 39, and then you take where he is in prison in chapter 40, you would say, if anything, Joseph, you're going backwards. You're going backwards in your life. And yet here's a man, young man, and he's believed to be in his late 20s. Bible commentators reckon around 28, 29 years of age. And yes, he is, by all intentions, he has lost his job. Potiphar has placed him in prison. And as I said, it doesn't look like he's going forward at all. Yet I believe in chapter 40, whilst he is in isolation really, he's in prison, he's locked down. We're very familiar with the term social distancing, and it seems that there's not really all that many people in this prison, just the butler and the baker. Certainly in terms of where Joseph is in this prison, he's placed in charge of these two men. And yet Joseph, whilst he's isolated, whilst it appears that he's going backwards in life, actually spiritually in Genesis chapter 40, I believe you see that he's actually making steps forward with the Lord in his time of isolation. And I trust today that this is your experience as isolation, as lockdown, self-isolation, as we're hemmed into our homes, and maybe just the first steps in terms of being released from this stage in lockdown for some of us, but for the vast majority of us, life is still very much the same. And once you might feel that you're not going forward, as it were, like Joseph, physically, in terms of life, in terms of your job, your occupation, whatever it might be, I trust that in spite of all that you face, that at this time of isolation, that spiritually it can be said of you, as it was said of Joseph here in Genesis chapter 40, that you are making steps forward with the Lord. Hosea chapter 6 and verse 3, the prophet Hosea, after speaking of Israel turning back to the Lord and the Lord healing their backslidings and so on, he speaks of following on to know the Lord. Following on to know the Lord. And I believe this is what is happening with Joseph here. This young man in Egypt, far away from home, far away from his brothers, far away from his beloved father. Here he is in isolation, and yet he's following on to know the Lord. He is making steps forward with the Lord in his time of isolation and lockdown, as he's here in prison in Genesis chapter 40. So for a few moments today, I just want to think about steps forward with God as we think about this general theme of isolation and lockdown. First thing I think we see here that show us that as Joseph is in prison, that he's making these steps forward in the Lord or with the Lord, is his perseverance. It's interesting in this chapter that if ever there was a man you could excuse for quitting in the Christian life, you could really excuse Joseph. I mean, you think of all that he has gone through in his life up until this occasion. He has been unfairly and wrongly mistreated by his brothers. His brothers have sold him. They then took that famous multicolored coat and they dipped it in blood and they brought it back to Jacob. They told Jacob, look, Joseph's dead. He's been taken and torn by an animal and so on. Joseph, of course, was sold really to the hands of Midianite slave traders, who then eventually bring him down to Egypt. And there in Egypt, he is faithful for the Lord. He walks with God. The Lord blesses him. He ends up working for Potiphar. And yet in chapter 39, you have that fateful chapter where Potiphar's wife, who sees that Joseph is a goodly young man to look at, that's really the thought there in Genesis 39. She persistently comes and tempts him. She says, lie with me, but Joseph runs. He says in that chapter, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against my God? And yet, what is the outcome of that? Well, Potiphar believes his wife's lie, and as a result, Joseph again is unfairly and wrongly thrown into prison. So Joseph has had a real rough time of it. He's been mistreated by his brothers, mistreated by his employer, and he's now in prison in Genesis chapter 40. And yet we read of him here continuing on with the Lord, just walking with him. Verse 15, he actually states that he had done nothing that he should be put in the dungeon. So we find him here persevering at a time when he could have quit, at a time when he could have quite frankly gave up on his faith in Jesus, his faith in the Lord Jesus. Yet we find him persevering. And this is a first thing that we see here in his time of isolation and lockdown. It was not his fault. Definitely not his fault. In actual fact, he was faithful to the Lord. And yet, for all of his faithfulness, he ends up in prison. But what is he doing? He's following on. He is making steps forward in his perseverance with the Lord. Child of God, it's good to take Joseph as an example. And we can think of all that we're facing in terms of our lockdown and our time of isolation. And yet Joseph here is teaching us the lesson of perseverance. It is, as I mentioned before in videos, it's not our fault. It's not your fault that you're in the situation that you're in terms of isolation, lockdown. This is something sent by the Lord. And yet we are encouraged here by Joseph to persevere, to continue. In Hebrews chapter 12, after encouraging the Jewish converts to run the race that was set before them with patience, you then read later on in that chapter that they were to consider him, lest they be wearied and faint in their minds. They were to consider the Lord, lest they be weary. In other words, lest they give up, lest they faint, lest they fail, lest they forsake the Lord. Again in Psalm 73, you read of the psalmist Asaph. And in the midst of that chapter, in the middle of that chapter, he exclaims that he had cleansed his hands in vain. In other words, he was following the Lord in vain. He looked at all that the wicked were getting away with in life, and he said, it's as if I've done this and it counts for nothing. And yet just a few verses later, you read of him understanding something of the ways of God as he went back to the house of God, as he entered into the sanctuary, he began to understand. And he was then made to see that there was a purpose. So we see again in Psalm 73 a picture of perseverance. Yes, he didn't understand all that was going on, and he felt like giving up. He felt that he had cleansed his hands. He had come to the Lord for no reason. It was all empty, all vain. And yet he persevered. Child of God, are you persevering today? Yes, there are times when you feel like quitting. Times when you don't feel like persevering, but whilst you may not be getting forward and making strides physically, you're hemmed in, you're locked down, yet are you spiritually, are you following on to know the Lord? Are you taking those steps forward with the Lord in perseverance, just like Joseph? Second lesson we learn here is patience. In Genesis chapter 40, we learned the lesson of patience from the life of Joseph. And in the middle of that chapter, verse 14, he comes to the butler. The butler, it seems, is escaping prison. And Joseph tells the butler, look, remember me when it's well with thee. In other words, when you get out of prison and Pharaoh asks you, about prisoners, about anybody who could perhaps be free. Remember me, remember me. But in chapter 41, you read that the butler doesn't remember Joseph for a full 2 years. It's only when Pharaoh has a dream and there's nobody to interpret the dream or understand the dream that the butler then comes to his mind, I remember Joseph. 2 full years. And yet Joseph, he's in prison. You still read of him faithfully serving the Lord, faithfully living for the Lord. And so here he was for a further 2 years in prison. Not only had he been patient in prison up to that point, but for a further 2 years. And yet you don't read of him cursing God. You don't read of him sinning against the Lord. You just read of him following the Lord faithfully. So he was very patient indeed in his time of isolation as he was there in that prison, wrongly, unjustly, and even when he had been promised that he would be getting out, or that Pharaoh would possibly remember him and favour him. 2 full years, and yet he still continued and persisted. And surely that as this lockdown continues, as the weeks are rolling into months now, and as the lockdown will gradually be lifted, surely we're all being taught the lesson of patience. Patience. Joseph here was being taught patience, and this was all preparatory work for him to be the next Prime Minister of Egypt and lead them through those years of plenty and then those years of famine, and be a wonderful influence for good in the land of Egypt. It was all preparing him. What is God teaching you through lockdown, child of God? He's teaching you patience. Patience for whatever will hold for you, the Lord has in store for you after lockdown. Patience in your daily Christian walk, patience in the workplace, patience as a young person, maybe in university, in student life, in school. Undoubtedly there's going to be changes next year to curriculums and to life in general, and we're all going to have to learn patience. And this is one of the ways in which the Lord teaches us this. As we're in lockdown, he's saying, look, be patient. As the psalmist states in Psalm 40, he waited patiently on the Lord, and the Lord heard him and heard his cry and his prayer. Of course, as you read through the scriptures, you'll discover that God used times of testing to bring about patience in many of his saints. You think of Moses, for example. Moses didn't just burst on the scene and immediately become the emancipator and the leader of Israel. He wasn't called until he was 80, and he had to learn 40 years of patience as he just looked after his father-in-law Jethro's flock. 40 years in the wilderness. You think of Elijah. Elijah didn't just become the prophet of God immediately. Yes, God called him, but he had to be taken to the brook Cherith, and then a little bit later to Zarephath and provided there. And that took 3 years. 3 years of famine. 3 years of waiting upon the Lord, of leaning upon the Lord. The Lord was teaching him patience in order to make him a better prophet. The Lord's teaching you patience in lockdown. Just to continue to wait on him, look to him and trust in him, and to bring it to pass. The last thing then, I believe, the last lesson we can see here in Joseph's life in Genesis chapter 40, as we see him making steps forward with the Lord. And we then see his perception as well, not only his perseverance and patience, but his perception. Joseph could have looked at his own circumstances and really just become absorbed in himself. And he had an awful lot going on, he had an awful lot on his plate. And yet, wonderfully, in verse 7, as he sees the butler and the baker, as he sees them sad, he asks them this question, why look ye so sad? So I want you to see here that Joseph is not concerned with his own problems only. No, he recognizes that these individuals, they've been brought along his path by God providentially, and he has the spiritual perception to see that there is an issue there and to see that there is a need, a way in which he can help. So he is making strides forward or steps forward in terms of his attitude of compassion and in terms of the fact that he sees that there's a need with others. He's not merely absorbed in himself and his own problems and all that's going on in his own isolation and lockdown. True child of God, there's a lesson there for us as well. That we would have this spiritual perception, like Joseph. Not that we would merely just be absorbed in our own problems, in our own lives, in our own challenges. And many of you will have big, big challenges ahead in the weeks and months to come. And yet, do we have spiritual perception, like Joseph, to see the needs of others and to say, here's a way in which perhaps I can help. Here, God has providentially brought this person, brought this need, this whatever it is, this circumstance before me, this individual, and here's something I can do for the Lord. And so I trust that you have even the experience of Joseph. Yes, you might not feel that you're going forward physically in a sense, that you're hemmed in, very much hemmed in. But I trust that you're making these strides forward, these steps forward with the Lord in your isolation spiritually, that you are growing in perseverance, that you're being taught patience, and that you have this perception that you see the need of others, even at such a time as this. Steps forward with the Lord.